Echo of Death, a Tom and Scott mystery, fifth book in the series. By Mark Richard Zubro, publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York, narrator, Eric Ost. Acknowledgements. For their kind help and patience, Barb D'Amato, Hugh Holton, Rick Paul, and Kathy Pekaiser Reed. Chapter 10. At the ambulance doors, I said, "I'm riding with him." No one objected. The trip to the hospital was silent except for moments when we passed over a railroad crossing. Then the person riding shotgun would say, "Tracks," and the people in back would hold Scott more steadily and hang on to an IV bottle, which was already dripping into his arm. At the hospital, they made me wait in the hall. I nearly went berserk at that rule, but the hospital personnel were firm, and the police insisted I tell them what had happened. Even that wouldn't have kept me from my lover, but one of the doctors, a man in his early 30s, said to me, "We're going to do everything we can. You can't help by getting in our way. You'll be able to see him as soon as we can allow it." I didn't ask whether Scott would be okay. I didn't want to hear an answer I couldn't live with. The doctor's voice was low and calm and soothing, and he had piercing violet eyes that met mine unflinchingly. He disappeared through the swinging doors of the emergency room. I got a cursory check from the emergency room personnel. They cleaned the back of my head where I banged it getting out of the crawl space. They slapped a Band-Aid on it and gave me a tetanus shot. Cops surrounded me, and one of them began asking questions. What I'd said at the L station had been more than enough to set them in motion to the 3 row houses and to guarantee a cop stayed close to me throughout the proceedings. They couldn't know for certain whether I was a suspect or good guy at the moment, and I didn't care. Nothing mattered except Scott. He had to be all right. Every time the doors back to where he was swung open, I began to rise to my feet. I wanted to see the young doctor emerge. Belowski and Quinn showed up a half hour later. "What the hell happened back here?" Belowski said. I stood up, advanced toward him, and gave him a look which would have stopped a herd of rampaging elephants. He took a step back. I said, "I saved my lover. Not you two, not any police, not anybody. I did." Then I began to shake, even though I'd been in the Marines. It had been 20 years, and lots of memories got buried very deep. But I had nearly been killed, and several evil people were dead at my hand, and I didn't know if Scott would live. I sat down and clutched my arms around myself to quell the shaking, but I wasn't through with my belligerence. "Anybody wants to dispute what I say, wants to tell a different side of the story, I don't care. I care about one thing, that Scott lives." I couldn't stop shaking. My voice was rising and breaking like a puberty-stricken adolescent. I knew I was beginning to lose it. Quinn sat next to me. "Tom," he said, "we'd like you to take everything real slow. Just talk to us about what happened. We need to move as quickly as possible to try to catch any people who may have gotten away." "A helicopter," I said. "They used one to arrive. Must have been somebody important. I heard it starting up as I took Scott to the train." Quinn barked several orders to a nearby uniformed cop who flew out of the room to call the FFA to check on all helicopter reports. "How did you find them?" Quinn asked. "Bill Proctor and I found the list of safe houses for Federico Torres around the world. This was the one in Chicago." "Why didn't you bring the information to us?" Quinn asked. "Bill Proctor was going to. He never got to you guys?" "No," Quinn said. "What happened to my lawyer and the Mexican authorities?" "Whoever grabbed them was more worried about Scott. They tried to move everybody to different cars near the Cabrini Green housing project this morning. The guards your lawyer hired managed to get everyone away except Scott. They didn't give us a lot to go on. The kidnappers seemed content with having Scott, and I didn't pursue the rest of them. They're lucky to be alive." Quinn asked for more details about our discovery of the materials. I told him about the post office and the packaging of the relics. I handed him the list, which I'd used to uncover the safe house on the south side. Quinn held the list more carefully than a scholar, holding a fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Belowski looked over his shoulder. After a few seconds reading, Quinn whistled. "This is incredible," he said. "How did you know he would be there?" "I didn't," I explained, about the relics, the computer disk, and the materials on Mr. and Mrs. Proctor. "That stuff on the parents could be very important. When I left him, Bill was supposed to be taking all that material to the authorities." I'm worried about him. Why did you bring it to us? Bolowaski asked. Because I wasn't going to waste a second waiting for the cops, whether it was warrants or due process or assembling a SWAT team to attack. They might have used Scott as a hostage. You people haven't been the most helpful. A uniformed cop trundled his bulk into the room. He spoke to Quinn. Lots of press outside. The Scott Carpenter baseball thing is on the radio. They want information. Quinn said, maybe a statement later. They'll want to stampede to the crime scene when they get word of that. Gonna be a hell of a day. The doctor came out of the emergency room. I rose to my feet, my trembling, which had eased somewhat during the questioning, returned. Are you Tom? The doctor asked. I nodded. He's asking for you. We usually only let family in, but he insisted. Is he going to be okay? He should be all right, the doctor said. We want to keep him here for observation, at least overnight. Besides the obvious external injuries, he's got a concussion and may have other internal injuries. He was beat up pretty bad. You can see him now. Quinn and Bolowaski left. The doctor led me through the emergency room doors to where he pulled back a sliding curtain. Scott's eyes were open, the last quarter inch of his mouth on the right, the only part not puffed and bruised, rose in a slight grin. He lifted 2 fingers in great greeting. The doctor left. I took his hand and with the other caressed his brow, moving his hair back. I don't feel good, he whispered. I love you, I said. I love you more than anything in the world. His hand gripped tighter in mine. Am I going to be okay? The doctor said yes. What happened? He asked. I told him everything that I'd done since he'd been taken, then asked, what did they do to you? He breathed quietly for a minute. He had 2 small hoses running to his nostrils. They had him hooked up to a couple of machines. One I figured had to be a heart rate and one blood pressure, but I wasn't sure. A few shells carried medical paraphernalia of use to someone, but incomprehensible to me. Mostly I was at that house, I think, Scott said. My arm hurts. I looked at the bandages where I'd seen his left arm burned deep with cigarettes. Do you want me to give you more painkillers? I asked. I want you to stay close, he said. Do you want anything? Need anything? He shook his head slightly. His eyelids nodded closed, then opened abruptly, then began to shut again. While still holding his hand, I gently caressed his arm, shoulder, forehead. His eyes fought with his brain to drift into sleep. Everything's okay now, I said. You're safe now. He shut his eyes. I felt his body relax, and in a few minutes, the grip on my hand began to loosen. I leaned over and gently kissed his forehead. Without opening his eyes, he murmured, I love you. I stayed with him for several hours. I found out later that time limits on visiting were pretty flexible. Mostly he slept. During Scott's transfer to intensive care, I had to wait in the hall, but Quinn and Bolowaski were back, and they gave me answers to questions that I had. Quinn was actually pretty nice about the whole thing. I was exhausted from lack of sleep and the physical and emotional exertion. I'd gotten several cans of orange juice from the cafeteria so far. That had sustained me. What'd you find on the south side? I asked. The scene was a mess, Quinn said. The crime lab guys have been at it for hours. We've got 5 dead bodies, including Federico and his brother Pedro Torres. One of the ones you shot is dead. The other one will probably live. The helicopter never got off the ground. 3 of the survivors have begun to talk. Who kidnapped Scott? I asked. Pedro, it seems, that the people chasing you got conflicting orders. Pedro's the one who wanted you alive. That's probably why the people with you when Scott was kidnapped didn't get chased. If it had been Federico, they'd probably all be dead. Why torture Scott? I asked. They wanted information, which he couldn't possibly give them, I said. Glenn Proctor really screwed things up, Quinn said. He must have been awfully busy in Mexico to accomplish all this in just a couple of weeks. I bet he'd been planning his schemes for a while, I said. Have you found Bill? Not yet. Do his parents know anything? I asked. Neither mother nor father claims to have seen him, Quinn said. Liars! Glenn was playing a dangerous game, Quinn said. I hope Bill's not caught up in it. What was the big fight about on the south side? I asked. You started that. I did? You did. That helicopter you heard was the arrival of Federico Torres himself. He was set to have a big meeting with his brother. Negotiations had been going on since Glenn Proctor, posing as Scott Carpenter, had managed to steal the information about all the safe houses, plus other shipments, dealers, and major distributors. Pedro had thought Glenn was just after his brother, but it seems Glenn was trying to double-cross him too. Glenn had some information on Pedro too. Glenn was trying to either double-cross both of them or extort money from both. Everybody was after Glenn. Federico just wanted him dead because he'd ruined their plans. He wanted vengeance. He knew he'd have to move his entire operation. He figured that Pedro would have the information in a short time in probably all the international police jurisdictions. Even somebody that rich has to worry at that point. Pedro wanted Glenn alive, long enough to talk to him. So the ones after us, who wanted to kill, were Federico's men, Quinn had finished for me. They just wanted you dead. There were two groups of guys trying to chase us outside our place. That morning, I said. They came from different sides of the building. One crowd didn't shoot because they wanted to talk. The other wanted to kill us. That sounds right, Quinn said. So if they were shooting, they were Federico's guys. And if not, they were Pedro's. Sort of, Quinn said. Let me finish about the battle, Quinn said. I was silent. The meeting between them was all set. Negotiations had been delicate because neither side trusted the other, but they knew they had to confront each other. When you started firing while you were rescuing Scott, the bodyguards on both sides figured that the truce was being broken. An enormous firefight broke out. You wouldn't believe what those houses look like, Belowski said. Combat Zone hardly describes it. Those guys have incredible firepower. Think of how much damage you did with the few weapons you had in that room. They let loose at each other with everything they had. We walked through the houses, Belowski said. Walls sagged because they'd been riddled with so many bullets. Stairways collapsed from having so much lumber shot away. These guys used big guns, Belowski seemed to relish the whole concept. Made the St. Valentine's Day Massacre look like the peanut gallery having a spat. Quinn said, It wasn't pretty. 5 dead, like I said, a few wounded, and the 3 who are talking to us. The fight was winding down when the cops started arriving. Fortunately, the first cops who showed up had the sense not to approach. They knew this wasn't some simple gang war. How did the police put a stop to it? I asked. We didn't, Quinn said. By the time we had the area secured, the L train stopped. The streets blocked, and whatever else was needed. The shooting had stopped. They weren't firing at us to begin with, and what was the point? So many of them were dead, and we had half the cops in the city outside there. After a while, those left alive inside knew it was pointless to try to shoot their way out. Are Scott and I still going to be in danger? I asked. With both Federico and Pedro dead, Quinn said. I doubt it. Federico looked like Swiss cheese, Belowski said. I made sure I got up close to see him. I wanted to be able to tell my grandkids. There isn't much of an organization left to chase you, Quinn said. Those 3 gave us all this information. All of them are going to be in jail in this country forever. And if enough time ever passes for them to be out of jail, then they'll be sent back to South America for more trials. They don't care about Scott Carpenter or Tom Mason anymore. Nobody cares anymore. So, Federico's guys killed Glenn Proctor, I said. That none of the 3 know for sure or would admit at this point. Quinn said, probably some of the dead guys executed him. We'd been sitting in a small conference room with modern fixtures and comfortable chairs. I was tired from lack of sleep and spent emotions. Someone knocked on the door and a young cop stuck his head in the room. He whispered briefly to Quinn, then left. Quinn said, Your lawyer's here. It was nearly noon. We met Todd, who was dressed impeccably as always. A woman named Deborah McKenna was with him. We trudged to the cafeteria where I guzzled more orange juice and wolfed down an omelet. We exchanged stories about our adventures. Then Todd said, Deborah's my accountant. She has found more information. She and I have been working together. Since I got her out of bed at 5 this morning, she wore a beige skirt, white blouse, and a blue blazer. Her briefcase was 5 inches thick and solid black. She opened it and pulled out 3 folders. I have more information on the Proctors. The government has been watching both people for some time, Deborah said. Each has been under investigation. Mr. Proctor is thought to have been bribing a slew of Mexican government employees. It is highly illegal to bribe foreign officials. It cost one company near $10 million in fines not more than a few years ago, and they lost a great deal of their business, so that kind of evidence is going to hurt him. He'll have to go to trial, of course, and it will take years, while the fines he'll have to pay aren't as critical as they would be to ordinary mortals. The loss of business will at least crimp his style. We've also been tracking down rumors of Mrs. Proctor being involved in an illegal banking scheme that would make the BCCI mess look like the local five and dime. The whole labyrinthine scheme is complicated even more because both Proctors spent huge amounts of time, money, and resources obfuscating their own and each other's work. Mother and father are fierce competitors, I said. They hate each other. They are desperate to hurt one another. They'd have sold a nursing home full of grandparents to get their way. Maybe Glenn was double-crossing both of them, too, I explained about the information Bill Proctor had. The data he has could probably really hurt them, she said. Won't the Mexican government want to do something about the relics we found, I asked. If the Proctors were involved, the Mexican government is not in the business of offending fabulously wealthy American business people who might invest millions in their country. They're going to be happy to get the relics back. Fake or real, they are more happy to get the jobs. Remember, they aren't that eager to prosecute for bribing their officials. It is against American laws, and they'll be prosecuted in American courts. Bill Proctor said his mother and father were supposed to have had some kind of big powwow, I said. If they're going to get together here, I'd like to get an invitation to that. Don't do something illegal, Todd warned. I told him I wouldn't. Deborah and Todd left. I asked the cops if Glenn was using an alias, and they killed him. Why did they chase us after they found the body in the penthouse? We don't know if whoever got there first thought they were killing Scott Carpenter or Glenn Proctor. The second group saw you run. Did they know who killed Glenn? If they looked at identification and saw Glenn Proctor and they were after Scott Carpenter, would that change what they did? We'll probably never be sure. A lot depends on who could recognize Proctor. We just don't know who got there first. The second group was probably Pedro's men, and they hadn't killed the dead guy, and they didn't know who you were. You didn't stay to answer questions. They may have chased you simply to talk to you, or they may have thought you had specific knowledge and they wanted to kill you. The guys who are talking are being helpful, but very careful. Their lawyers are with them, so it's a very touchy situation. Who came and got the body and why, I asked. And if it wasn't the killers, how did whoever came know it was there? Even with these unanswered questions, none of the official folks wanted to pursue Glenn's death. They had buckets full of suspects on the south side, all dead, without a body. There wasn't a lot to work with. Besides, they had a perfect explanation with the biggest drug kingpins on 2 continents dead in the city morgue. The Proctor murder was a case of mistaken identity. Borowski said, "Be glad it wasn't you and forget it." The cops left. I visited with Scott. He was awake, and I gave him all the news, but he was tired and I was exhausted. After a while, he pressed the button on the side of the bed to lower it. When it reached a comfortable spot, he took his finger off the control, leaned back, and shut his eyes. I thought I'd sit in the chair for a while before going home. After a few minutes, I'd begun to nod off when a nurse came in. She had a puzzled expression on her face. "This just came for Scott Carpenter or Tom Mason," she said. She looked at Scott. "I know who he is, but who's Mason?" "I am," I said. She gave me the envelope. "Where'd this come from?" I asked. "One of those messenger services," she said. She left. Inside the envelope was a message from Bill Proctor. It didn't say where he was, but it did say that he had a meeting with his parents at the North Shore mansion late this afternoon. He asked me to be there. I realized he couldn't have called because of the multitude of media. We'd had the phone turned off in Scott's room. The cops had brought my pickup truck to the hospital. I stopped in the cafeteria and drank 3 more cans of orange juice, which revived me enough for the moment. Lakeshore Drive, Sheridan Road, all the wealth of the north suburbs were a blur as I sped to the Proctors. It was late afternoon and the rush hour traffic was heavy. When I got there, I wasn't about to knock and ask permission to enter. I drove to 100 feet from the front entrance. I set the truck in gear and jumped out. I then climbed the wall, jumped down to the other side, and strolled to the front door. I figured they had some kind of surveillance on the grounds, but I hoped the diversion of the truck smashing into the gate and my determination would get me through. Actually, I got as far as the liveried servant and the front door before several armed security guards in green armored fatigues showed up. I grabbed James, the butler, and used him as a buffer for the few seconds it took to get inside. "Where are they?" I said. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," he said. "Not bad for a guy with an arm around his windpipe." I flung him outside and slammed the door, then raced to the grand staircase. I took the stairs 3 at a time. They'd have to figure out where I'd gone. This seemed my quickest way out of anybody's line of sight. Seconds after I reached the top, I heard wild scrambling and feet pounding behind me on the marble floor, then the soft thud of boots thumping on the carpet up the stairs after me. For a few seconds I felt as if I was in one of those Marx Brothers comedies, or maybe the Three Stooges, with doors opening and slamming shut and characters rushing in and out. I managed to get back to the first floor to a room that opened onto a patio outside, some French windows, before a machine-gun-toting kid, maybe all of 18, met me coming in a door. I was going out. He leveled the trembling gun in my direction. A door opened behind me. "What is this?" Jason Proctor's voice said. I swiveled my head around and the kid poked the muzzle of his gun into my chest. I stepped back. Mr. Proctor approached. "We're going to talk," I said. He glared at me. "Get rid of him," Proctor said. "If you have to, shoot him." "Is that how Glenn died?" I asked. "You just gave an order and the boys took care of it for you?" He walked up to me swiftly and slapped me hard. "Not happy about the truth?" I caught his hand the next time he raised it, but my soldier buddy whacked me on the side of the head with his gun. I barely felt it, the adrenaline pouring through my body. Mrs. Proctor walked into my field of vision from the back of the room. "Jason?" Her voice was sharp. The 3 of us looked at her as she marched across the room. "We'll discuss this like civilized people." By this point, a large contingent of servants and guards had arrived. "Go," Mrs. Proctor commanded. One word, and they went. "Bill is in the library," she said. She led us to her room with floor-to-ceiling bookcases lined with books that all had golden spines and embossed lettering. 3 groups of black leather chairs set from the front of the room to the back one. One at the door, one in the middle, and one at the far end. And one of the black leather chairs in the middle of the room, Bill Proctor sat. He wore a white fisherman's sweater, dark blue jeans, and white socks and gym shoes. He barely looked at me. Mrs. Proctor wore a beige wool pantsuit. Mr. Proctor was in a blue blazer, white shirt, duck trousers, and penny loafers. Mrs. Proctor pointed at me. "Why is this person here?" "Because he was honest with me. Because I trust him. Because I want him here," Bill said. He glared at his mother. With practiced grace, she shrugged off his tone and aggressiveness and indicated seats. I took the chair across from Bill, and Mr. Proctor sat to my right. Mrs. Proctor told her husband she didn't want a chair. She stood in the center of the oriental carpet that nearly touched the bookcases around the edges. "Where have you been?" I asked Bill. He picked up a briefcase from next to his chair. He clicked the locks open and spilled the contents over the rug. "What's the meaning of this?" Mr. Proctor said. "Oh, bluster out your ass, Jason," Mrs. Proctor said. "Where's Glenn's body?" Bill asked. "How dare you?" Jason asked. "How dare I, Dad?" "I'll tell you how. I've been using the past 12 hours to have all the materials on the disc transcribed and analyzed. It cost me a small fortune, but I learned how to spin from both of you. Besides being a record of all that Glenn had been up to, it was a record of what you and your companies have been doing." Bill was breathing heavily, and his fist clenched and unclenched. "Now, son," Mr. Proctor started. I'm going to do all the talking, Bill said. Shut up and let him, Mrs. Proctor said. You keep silent too, Mom, Bill said. Mouth agape, she plopped abruptly into a chair. Bill picked up a sheaf of papers from the floor. Glenn explained everything in code on paper on the computer disks. First, the necklaces. That was a lark he got into just 2 weeks ago. He's working with the drug people for a while, but he just got the information on them about 2 months ago. The final details a few days before he was killed. The relic stealing was a fluke. Brad Stawalski got some hot stuff he couldn't get rid of. He knew Glenn had connections. Brad didn't tell the truth. Neither of you thought Glenn could ever make plans and carry them out, but he did. I know that a lot of what he did was to con people. He took precautions when dealing with the drug people, like using a fake name. Bill tossed the papers he'd been holding in a heap on the floor. He wiped his hands across his face. Both of his parents started to speak. Be silent, he shouted at them. Just for once in your lives, shut the fuck up. The fury and anger in his tone and the glare of his eyes pierced through their consciousness and held them dumb. The rest of the information on the disc were about you two. Glenn wasn't just trying to get dirt on you guys. He actually seemed to be trying to be part of both companies. He desperately wanted you to respect him. Even more, Glenn the Joker, the wild one, always desperately wanted the two of you to get along. We used to talk about it. He wanted no more fights. All that acting out he did as a kid was a way to try and get your attention off each other and onto himself. Glenn hadn't changed much. I knew he wouldn't do anything illegal against us, Mrs. Proctor managed to get in. He was getting dirt, and it was illegal, Bill said. He was in Mexico bribing people to screw Dad out of projects you, Mom, had bribed people to sabotage. These people picked up triple bribes. They must have thought they'd latched onto the lost treasure of El Dorado. And speaking of bribes, he got some great information out of your banking people, Mom. Bill barked a one-note harsh laugh that jarred off of all of my teacher instincts. He continued, and Glenn was using money from both of your companies to bribe everybody. Maybe he thought it would be something of a lark to screw up both of your companies. You know how wild and crazy he was? Who knows what he may have actually been planning? Bill shut his eyes and leaned back in the chair. Both parents spoke at once. Bill let it go for several minutes as each parent got louder and louder. Suddenly he opened his eyes and leaned forward. As his parents each drew a breath, he said, "Shut up." Speaking the words softly as he did had an enormous impact. We sat in silence. The grandfather clock near the door chimed 7 o'clock. I wanted to go home and sleep for days. Bill said to me, "What did the police find?" I heard snatches of news about what happened on the south side. I told him what happened. What the cops don't know, and once again are ignoring, is who killed Glenn. I know the relic people never got close enough to kill anybody. The necklace people got what they wanted. That leaves the drug people and you three. There were two sides in the drug war, pro and anti-Federico. I explained what the cops had pieced together. I finished. My guess is by the time either one of them got to the penthouse, Glenn was already dead. I tend to think it was Pedro who got there, who chased us first because they didn't fire at us as quickly. The cops just think it's settled because they've got all these dead drug dealers. But I think it went beyond that. I think both gangs attacked us. The next morning, they may have begun to think things were truly strange when they were chasing another guy who looked like Glenn. Maybe he thought Glenn had told us something. Maybe he thought Scott was Glenn. Or as turned out to be true, they thought he sent us something. All that means is that some of the drug people didn't know or weren't satisfied with one death. Maybe Federico wanted to eliminate anybody connected with Glenn. Remember that fanatics killed the guy who translated Salman Rushdie's work into Japanese just because he translated it? If Federico was mad, who knows? But I don't think the drug people got to Glenn. I think somebody else got there first. I glared at the assembled Proctors. The question is, which one of you knew Glenn was in town? He didn't make any calls while we were around. Which one of you did he call? What did he say? He was probably blackmailing both of you. Who was he going to take a bite out of first? And most? Who had the most to lose? Who would order the murder of his or her own child? Jason Proctor stood up and took a step toward me. I rose, as did Bill. The son forestalled his father's progress. You killed him, Bill said. Your rivalry killed him. Somehow I knew it would come to this. How dare you accuse your mother and me of having anything to do with your brother's death? Certainly we have been tough when it comes to business. You either get tough or lose. But we never try and hurt our own son. If what you say about what he found out is true, then we will have to take action immediately to minimize our losses. There was no blackmail. That rivalry gave you a fabulous home, Mrs. Proctor said, and a life with chances and privileges that few people ever have. You must turn over to us all the information you have immediately. Bill paced the floor between the chairs. You two are the most disgusting people on the face of the planet. This family is so screwed up. Your son is dead, and all you can think of is saving your ass, or defending the rivalry between the two of you. All either Glenn or I wanted was your love. They stared at him silently, as if the words had been spoken before, and they were used to them, or there was truth in them, and it held them dumb, or that no matter how much hurt was in them, nothing could touch them, because they were rich and different. Bill resumed. People come to this house with ghastly news, and I'm not told. Why is that, Father? You had something to hide from the beginning. I called you, Mother, and you said you knew nothing. Either one of you had the power and strength to get a body moved and hide it. Which one of you killed my brother? No one killed him, Jason Proctor said. Then how did he get dead? Bill asked. The two parents gazed at each other. Mrs. Proctor's eyes became moist. It was a horrible accident, she said. Orders were given in Mexico to find Glenn, Mr. Proctor said. Our people kept running across the name Scott Carpenter as someone nosing into our affairs. We never dreamed Glenn was using that name. Both of our people had orders to stop Scott Carpenter at all costs and to bring Glenn home. We sent private guards from here to help out. Not all of them knew Glenn by sight, Mrs. Proctor spoke slowly. Our guards here do, of course, Jason said, but the Mexican people didn't. They followed who they thought was Scott Carpenter to his place in Chicago. They were half a day behind him. The people we sent to help search were also close behind, but Glenn was good at wriggling out of tight spots. He called both of us to announce he wanted to meet with us at the penthouse. Mrs. Proctor said he didn't want to meet here or at any of the offices. He wanted us alone on neutral ground. He told us he had succeeded and that we would be proud of him for the first time. It took over an hour to drive down from here. By then, he was dead. Mason and Carpenter had been chased off. We found the body. At first, we thought the drug people had got him. We had no idea who done it, but we didn't want a scandal. We organized the cleaning and removal. We set up internal investigations of all our security personnel. I allowed Mason and Carpenter into the house the next day to see whether they knew anything substantial. Mrs. Proctor said, We barely slept. We sent our people everywhere, south of the border, to track information on the drug lords because we thought they'd killed him. We got nowhere. Finally, we received information from our operatives that they'd killed Scott Carpenter. We knew then that a horrible mistake had been made. When did you find this out? I asked. We've gotten bits of information all weekend. The people chasing Glenn from Mexico reported to their superiors there. You knew Monday when we talked to you, I said to Mrs. Proctor. I don't answer to you, she said. You ordered them to kill Scott Carpenter, I asked. Accidents happen, Mrs. Proctor said. You see, Jason, Proctor said, it was all an accident. It was nobody's fault. Bill Proctor's laugh was long and unhealthy, the kind of laugh that you rushed to the phone to call in a team of therapists when you heard it. An accident, he roared. He pointed his right index finger at his parents, fixing them in place. Nobody's fault. The laughter pealed again. Mrs. Proctor stood up and reached a hand toward her son. Bill, she said, but he laughed again. He stopped to his briefcase, flicked it open, and came up with an enormous gun. The hole in Mr. Proctor's chest was geysering before I could leap to my feet. Mrs. Proctor's scream was cut short by a bullet in her throat. I was halfway to Bill when he raised the gun to his temple, shut his eyes, and pulled the trigger. I heard pounding feet, so I knew I didn't have to shout for help. I knelt next to each in turn, starting with Bill. The blood was awful. My feelings of pity and terror kept me numb. I thought it might be possible to save Mrs. Proctor. Mr. and Bill were beyond any help. She died on the operating table 2 hours later. I don't remember much about the interrogation by the police. I do know that Todd, my lawyer, showed up. He got me out of there in a reasonable amount of time. I know I called Scott that night before I went to sleep and told him everything. I also called school and explained what had happened and told them I wouldn't be in the next day either. The principal was very understanding. I slept for 18 hours. A month later, we sat in the breakfast nook of the penthouse. Scott's wounds had healed, although he'd have permanent scars on his left arm. We were almost back to our normal level of workouts as Scott's body got back into shape. Spread out over the butcher block tabletop were the plans for my new house in the suburbs, which would be built on what I would be able to afford from my salary. I like this, he said. These were the final drawings of the plans. Building would begin in a few weeks. It's beautiful, I said. It'll be like we always had it, a place to stay in the city and a place out near where I work. Scott grabbed my hand and pulled me over to him. I stretched over the top of the table so our lips met. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.